The main street of Pine Ridge was little more than a wide trail beaten hard by wagon wheels and horse hooves. Dust drifted in low clouds with every step, catching the late afternoon sunlight. A line of tired buildings stood against the relentless Wyoming wind. Saloon, livery, trading post, blacksmith shed, all marked by fading paint and weathered wood. Mason Reeves pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from both the sun and the curious glances of townsfolk. He hadn't come to Pine Ridge in nearly 6 months, preferring the isolation of his ranch 12 miles north. The familiar weight of being watched settled on his shoulders as he tied his horse outside the general store. His tall frame cast a long shadow, his movements stiff from the day's ride. The scar that dragged along his jawline seemed to tighten in the chill air. At 40, Mason carried the look of a man carved by weather and grief, eyes that rarely met anyone else's, shoulders permanently squared as if expecting a blow. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's greeting died halfway, replaced by a curt nod. Mason returned it just as briefly. Words were currency he rarely spent. "Need horseshoe nails," he said, voice rough from disuse. "And medicine for colic. The gray mare's sick." As the shopkeeper gathered his items, Mason noticed an unusual commotion outside. Through the dusty window, he could see people gathering in the street, voices rising with excitement and something uglier. "What's happening out there?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. The shopkeeper glanced up, a curious smile playing on his lips. "Special delivery from the Army outpost. Apache girl being bound to whoever'll take her. Chief sent her as part of some agreement." Mason frowned. "What agreement?" "Who knows? Army says she's to be placed with someone from town. Nobody seems eager, though." The man leaned forward. "She's blind as a bat." Mason felt his jaw tighten. He laid coins on the counter, gathered his purchases, and turned to leave. "You might want to watch," the shopkeeper called after him. "Ain't every day we get entertainment in Pine Ridge." Outside, the crowd had grown. Mason intended to mount his horse and ride straight home, but the press of bodies blocked his path. Reluctantly, he stopped at the edge of the gathering, towering over most heads. What he saw made his stomach turn. In the center of the street stood a young woman. She was clearly Apache, with copper skin and long black hair falling loose down her back. Her dress was traditional deerskin, but torn deliberately at the hem and neckline, exposing more than was decent. Despite this humiliation, she stood straight-backed, chin lifted. Her eyes were clouded, pale gray, unseeing yet somehow steady. A man Mason recognized as the town clerk stood beside her, waving papers. "Chief sent her as part of the new treaty," he announced. "She's to be bound proper like. Someone's got to sign or she'll rot where she stands." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone spat in the dirt near her feet. "What good's a blind squaw?" a voice called. "Can't even see what she's cooking." The woman flinched slightly at the jeers but maintained her dignity. Mason felt something stir in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite pity, but something he hadn't felt in years. He told himself to leave. This wasn't his concern. He had the mare to tend to, fences to mend. The solitude of his ranch beckoned like a promise. He turned to go, but a man bumped roughly against him, pushing him forward. Mason found himself closer to the center than he'd intended. The clerk caught sight of him and smiled coldly. "Reeves, didn't expect to see you in town." The clerk held out the papers. "How about it? You live alone out there. Could use some company, couldn't you?" More laughter. Mason stared at the clerk, saying nothing. "Come on, it's just a mark," the clerk pushed, shoving the paper toward him. "Nobody else wants her. Be ashamed to leave her standing here." Mason should have walked away. He felt the familiar heaviness in his chest, the same that came whenever people pressed on him more than he liked. But weariness made him slow, and before he fully realized what was happening, the clerk had pushed a pencil into his hand. The paper slid across. His mark scrawled before he'd fully considered what he was doing. The crowd fell quiet, then broke into laughter. "Well, Reeves has gone and done it," the clerk smirked. "Blind squaw's yours now." Mason stood frozen, realizing his mistake too late. He folded the paper roughly and shoved it into his coat. Years ago, he might have argued, might have torn up the paper and walked away. But he'd learned that silence shut men up quicker than arguments. He turned toward the woman. She hadn't moved, but something in her posture had changed. as though she sensed the shift in her circumstances. Mason approached slowly, aware of the eyes following him. When he reached her, he hesitated before touching her wrist lightly. "Come on," he said, his voice barely audible. She startled at his touch but didn't pull away. Her face gave nothing away as he led her to his horse. The crowd parted, still chuckling and muttering comments Mason refused to hear. He mounted first, then reached down and lifted her up behind him with one fluid motion. She settled behind him without protest, her hands finding the back of his coat to hold on. As he nudged his horse forward, the clerk called after them, "Enjoy your new wife, Reeves." More laughter followed them out of town. Mason kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched tight. Behind him, the woman sat in silence, her grip on his coat neither too tight nor too loose, just enough to keep steady. The road stretched before them, 12 miles of open country between town and his ranch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plains, promising night would fall before they reached home. Neither spoke. The sound of hooves on hard ground filled the silence, carrying them both toward a life neither had planned. By the time they reached his ranch, dusk had settled over the land. The cabin sat small against the vast landscape, walls leaning but still solid, surrounded by the weathered structures of a working ranch gone to seed. Fences sagged, the barn roof needed repair, and the corral gate hung askew. Mason felt her straighten slightly when the horse slowed. She couldn't see the place, but she knew the rhythm of the ride had changed. "This your place?" she asked, her voice surprisingly clear and steady. Mason gave a short nod before remembering she couldn't see it. "Yes," he said gruffly. She didn't ask more. That unsettled him somehow. Most women, he remembered, would have demanded explanations or assurances. She simply waited. When they reached the porch, Mason dismounted and helped her down. Her feet touched the ground, and she stood still, shoulders squared, listening. He led his horse to the small corral, removed the saddle, and fed the animal before returning to where she waited patiently on the porch. "Come in," he said, opening the door. Inside the cabin, shadows clung to every corner. Mason lit a small lantern, the flame throwing weak light across the one-room home. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, a stove near the center, shelves lined with tools, tins, and a few books gathering dust. The place smelled of ash, leather, and solitude. She sniffed the air faintly, her head tilting as she took in the sense of the place. "You live here alone," she stated rather than asked. "Yes." He set his purchases on the table. "It's enough." She nodded once, her expression unreadable. "It will do." Mason busied himself with the stove, setting kindling and striking flint until a flame took. The familiar motions gave him something to focus on besides the stranger now standing in his home. "What do they call you?" he asked finally. "Taya," she answered, her lips pressed together briefly, as if testing whether to say more. "Taya," he repeated, testing the sound. "I'm Mason, Mason Reeves." Her blind eyes seemed to fix on his voice. "I know." He paused, wondering how she knew his name, then remembered the clerk had used it in town. Of course. Mason noticed then how torn her dress really was. The neckline had split enough to reveal the upper curve of her chest. The fabric frayed deliberately at the edges. The hem hung ragged above her knees. He looked away quickly, guilt pressing into his chest. He took down bread left from the day before, cut thick slices, and set them on a plate along with some dried venison. "There's food here," he said, placing it on the table. "Water in the bucket by the stove." She moved toward the table carefully, one hand outstretched until she found the edge. He watched as her fingers traced the grain of the wood, then found the plate. She ate in silence, small and steady bites, as if she had gone too long without food and didn't trust there would be more later. Mason ate little, watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. He couldn't stop thinking about how she had stood in the street while men jeered. He asked himself why he hadn't just walked away, why he had signed his name. "You didn't choose this," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. His fork paused. "Neither did you," he answered. Her lips curved in something close to a bitter smile. "No." The truth sat heavy between them. Mason rose and pulled out the single blanket he owned that wasn't worn thin. He spread it across the bed, then paused. It was the only bed in the cabin. "You take the bed," he said firmly. "I'll take the chair." She hesitated, then nodded. She slipped off her moccasins, setting them neatly by the wall, and lowered herself onto the mattress. She did not lie down at first, only sat with her hands in her lap, as if listening for judgment. Mason turned his back, took the chair by the fire, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. In the quiet, he found his own thoughts harder to avoid. He thought of Rebecca's face, her laugh, the way she had sung softly while mending shirts. That memory had haunted him every night for 5 years. Now another woman lay in his bed, though not by his choice or hers. He wondered if he was betraying Rebecca just by allowing it. When he glanced back, he saw Tahia finally lying down, her hair spread across the quilt, her blind eyes closed, her breathing steady. She looked smaller now, younger somehow, the pride she'd worn in the street momentarily set aside. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind pressed against the boards. Inside, the cabin felt less hollow than it had in years, though Mason wasn't ready to examine why. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming hills. Mason woke stiff in the chair, his neck aching from the awkward position. He'd slept poorly, aware of each shift in breath from the woman in his bed. When he stood, joints cracking in protest, he saw Tahia was already awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, head tilted toward the sound of his movement. "Morning," he muttered, not used to speaking this early. She nodded in acknowledgement. "The sun is rising. I can feel the warmth." Mason paused, surprised by her perception. "Yes." He moved to the stove, building a fire and setting water to boil for coffee. Out of habit, he reached for 2 cups instead of one, then hesitated, wondering if she drank coffee. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Black." As Mason prepared breakfast, more bread, some dried apples he'd been saving, he found himself watching Tahia. She rose from the bed and moved cautiously around the cabin, one hand slightly extended, fingers brushing surfaces as she passed. She didn't ask for help finding the water bucket or the small shelf where he kept a dented basin. She splashed water over her face and hands with practiced care. He noticed the way her fingers moved, slow but sure, every step measured. She didn't stumble or knock things over as he might have expected. "You've been blind a while," he observed, setting the cups on the table. Tahia turned toward his voice. "Since I was 14. Sickness took my sight." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They ate in silence again, but it felt less strained than the night before. When they finished, Mason gathered his coat. "I need to check the mare," he said. "She's been sick." Tahia stood. "I'll come with you." Mason frowned. "The ground's uneven. It's muddy from yesterday's rain." Her chin lifted slightly. "I can manage." Something in her tone stopped him from arguing further. He opened the door and stepped outside, glancing back to see if she would follow. She did, moving carefully but with surprising confidence. The gray mare was in the small barn, looking better than the day before but still not eating properly. Mason checked her water, then mixed the medicine he'd bought with some feed. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Tahia standing just inside the barn door, her head tilted as she listened to his movements. "What's wrong with her?" she asked. "Colic, I think. She's been off her feed for 2 days." Tahia moved forward slowly, following the sound of his voice. When she reached the stall, she extended her hand, palm flat. "May I?" Mason hesitated, then nodded before remembering she couldn't see. "Yes." He watched as she gently ran her hand along the mare's neck and flank. Her touch was careful, purposeful. The horse, usually skittish with strangers, stood calmly. "Her belly is tight," Tahia said. "Pain here." Her hand rested just behind the mare's ribs. "In my people's ways, we would use a tea of willow bark and mint. It eases the cramping." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Do those plants grow around here?" "Yes, the willow near water, mint in damp places under trees." He considered this. The medicine he'd bought was expensive and not always effective. "I'll look for them later," he said. They returned to the cabin, Tahia trailing her hand along the fence to guide her way. Mason watched her navigate the yard, impressed despite himself at her determination not to appear helpless. Inside, an awkward silence fell. Mason was used to being alone, moving through his day without need for conversation. Now he felt obligated to explain his intentions, though he wasn't sure what those were beyond getting through this strange situation. "I need to mend the north fence today. he said finally. A tree fell on it during the last storm. Taya nodded. What shall I do? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't considered what she would do while he worked. Whatever you want, I suppose. Rest. There's food. A faint smile touched her lips. I don't need rest, Mason Reeves. I can work. Doing what? I can cook, clean, mend things. I'm not helpless because I cannot see. He studied her, noting the determination in her posture. The cabin doesn't need much cleaning, he said, but there's a shirt needs mending. Tore it on a nail last week. She nodded, seeming pleased to have a task. Where is it? He retrieved the shirt from a peg and handed it to her. Her fingers quickly found the tear along the sleeve. Thread? Needle? Mason found a small sewing kit, a relic from Rebecca's things that he'd kept out of necessity rather than sentiment. He placed it in her hand, watching as she efficiently opened it and threaded a needle, testing the sharpness with her fingertip. I'll be back before sundown, he said, moving toward the door. I'll be here, she replied simply. Outside, Mason paused on the porch, unsettled by the exchange. He'd lived alone for so long that having another person in his space felt like an intrusion. Yet there was something about Tahia that didn't grate on him as he'd expected. She didn't demand conversation or reassurances. She simply existed alongside him, carving out her own place. As he walked to the north pasture, tools in hand, he wondered what Rebecca would think of this arrangement. The thought brought the familiar ache to his chest, but it was duller than usual, tempered by the practical concerns of the present. For the first time in years, Mason Reeves had something to think about besides his own grief. The afternoon stretched long as Mason worked on the broken fence. The fallen pine had taken out nearly 20 feet of railing, leaving a gap where his few remaining cattle could easily wander off. He worked methodically, sawing the tree into manageable sections, pulling splintered posts and setting new ones. Physical labor had been his salvation after Rebecca died. The ranch had flourished initially under his obsessive work, but as the years passed and grief hardened into something more permanent, his enthusiasm waned. Now he did only what was necessary to maintain the property, nothing more. As the sun began its descent, he gathered his tools and headed back toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line, the air having gone still as evening approached. The sight gave him pause. Coming home to smoke from his chimney was a memory from another life. Inside, he found Tahia kneeling by the stove, stirring something in his old iron pot. The smell of cooking meat and herbs filled the cabin. She turned her head at the sound of the door. You're back, she said. I found dried meat and some potatoes in your storehouse. Hope that's all right. Mason set his tools down by the door. You went to the storehouse? Yes. She stirred the pot again. 15 steps east of the cabin door, 5 steps north. Small building with a wooden latch. He blinked, surprised at her precise knowledge of the layout. You counted steps? A small smile touched her lips. I always count steps. It's how I see the world. Mason hung his coat on the peg, noting his torn shirt was folded neatly on the table, the tear nearly invisible where she'd mended it. The stitches were small and even, better than he could have done himself. You fixed my shirt, he said. Yes, the tear wasn't bad, just needed proper alignment. She rose from the stove, moving to the shelf where he kept his few dishes. Her hand found 2 bowls without hesitation. How did you know where those were? He asked. I explored while you were gone, counted steps, felt each shelf and what it held. She ladled stew into the bowls. A home is just a pattern. Once you know the pattern, you don't need eyes to see it. They ate in silence, but it was different from the night before. Less tense, more companionable. The stew was better than anything Mason had made for himself in years, seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize. This is good, he said, surprising himself by breaking the silence first. Thank you. She tilted her head. Your voice sounds different when you're not guarded. Mason paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? Most times your voice is tight, like you're holding something back. Just now it was looser. She took another bite of stew. It's a good change. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he focused on his food. When they finished, he took the bowls to the wash basin while Tahia returned to the bed, sitting on its edge with her hands folded in her lap. Mason, she said as he wiped the dishes dry, there's something I should tell you. He turned, sensing a shift in her demeanor. What? My father didn't sell me. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened in her lap. He sent me away to protect me. Mason set down the dish towel. Protect you from what? There's trouble coming between my people and the army. My father is... She hesitated. He is an important man among the Apache, a leader. He saw in a dream that I would be safer with the white people for a time. A dream told him to send his daughter away? Mason couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Dreams are important to my people, especially dreams of those who can see beyond the ordinary. She lifted her chin. My father knew I would be refused by most because of my blindness, but he believed someone with a good heart would take me in. Mason frowned. So I was part of your father's plan? Not you specifically, but someone like you. Her blind eyes seemed to find him in the darkness. Someone who would sign those papers not out of desire, but out of decency. The implications settled heavily between them. Mason wasn't sure whether to feel manipulated or oddly honored. He opted for neither, focusing instead on the practical. So what happens now? How long are you supposed to stay? Until it's safe to return, or... She hesitated. Or until I choose a different path. Mason ran a hand over his face, feeling the day's stubble rough against his palm. You're saying you might not go back at all? I'm saying the future isn't written yet. She smiled faintly. Even those who see visions can't know everything. Mason stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the silent, seemingly helpless figure from the town square. There was a quiet intelligence in her that he hadn't expected, a self-possession that went beyond mere pride. You should rest, he said finally, unwilling to pursue the conversation further. It's been a long day. She nodded, lying down on the bed without further discussion. Mason took his place in the chair again, stoking the fire one last time before stretching his legs toward the warmth. As the cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire, Mason found his thoughts wandering. He had signed those papers, expecting nothing but a brief, awkward encounter before finding a way to send her back to her people. Now he wasn't so sure what would happen next. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Inside, two strangers bound by circumstance and a hasty signature drifted towards sleep, each wondering what the dawn would bring. Days passed in an unexpected rhythm. Tahia adapted to life at the ranch with a speed and competence that Mason found both impressive and unsettling. She learned the layout of the cabin completely, moving through the small space as confidently as if she could see every corner. She cooked meals, mended clothes, and insisted on helping with chores outside as well. At first, Mason was reluctant to let her work beyond the cabin. The ranch yard was uneven, scattered with tools and debris he'd never bothered to clear away. But Tahia was persistent. I'm not made of glass, she said one morning, when he suggested she stay inside while he repaired the barn roof. I won't break from a little work. Against his better judgment, he relented. To his surprise, she proved useful, holding nails and passing tools up to him as he worked on the roof. She could identify different tools by touch alone and seemed to have an uncanny sense for when he needed something before he asked. By the end of the first week, they had settled into a routine that felt almost natural. They rose at dawn, ate a simple breakfast, and worked through the day on the endless tasks a ranch demanded. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, mostly in silence, though occasionally exchanging bits of conversation that revealed little pieces of themselves. Mason learned that Tahia had been educated by a missionary for several years before losing her sight, which explained her perfect English. She had a younger brother she hadn't seen in many years, and a skill for healing that extended beyond humans to animals as well. The gray mare recovered quickly under her care, responding to the herbal remedies Tahia prepared. In turn, Mason found himself sharing small details of his own life, his time as a cavalry soldier during the war, his marriage to Rebecca, the years he'd spent building the ranch into something they could be proud of before illness took her and their unborn child. He didn't speak of his grief directly, but Tahia seemed to understand it nonetheless. She never pushed for more than he was willing to give, respecting the boundaries of his pain in a way that made it strangely easier to bear. On the 10th day, as they ate breakfast, a sound pulled Mason's attention to the window. Hoofbeats approached, multiple riders by the sound of it. Visitors were rare at the Reeves Ranch and rarely welcome. Someone's coming, he said, reaching for his rifle leaning by the door. Tahia's head tilted, listening. 3 horses, men talking. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the precision of her hearing, then moved to the window. Through the wavy glass, he could make out 3 riders approaching from the direction of town. He recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Logan, a man he'd had little dealing with over the years. "It's the sheriff," he told Tahia, "and 2 others." She stood, her expression suddenly guarded. "What do they want?" "We'll find out." Mason set the rifle back, but left it within easy reach. He stepped onto the porch as the riders approached, closing the door behind him. Sheriff Logan reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. He was a tall man with a graying mustache and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. The 2 men flanking him were younger, one a ranch hand Mason vaguely recognized from the Carter place to the east, the other a stranger. "Reeves," the sheriff nodded in greeting. "Been a while." "Sheriff," Mason returned the nod. "Something wrong?" Logan dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Might be. Wanted to check on your situation." His eyes flicked to the cabin door behind Mason. "Word is you took in that Apache girl from town." Mason's jaw tightened. "That's right. Any trouble with her?" "No." The sheriff studied him for a moment. "Mind if I see her? Make sure everything's proper." Mason didn't move from his position, blocking the door. "She's fine, Sheriff. No need to bother her." Logan's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not just a social call, Reeves. We've had reports of Apache warriors spotted near Taylor's Creek, just 8 miles from here. Cattle killed, signs they might be planning something bigger." "What's that got to do with Tahia?" "Tahia, is it?" Logan raised an eyebrow. "Getting friendly, I see. Look, I'm not accusing her of anything, but if she's got family out there, they might try to contact her, or she might have information that could help us prevent trouble." Mason considered this. He didn't want these men questioning Tahia, but refusing outright would only raise suspicions. Before he could decide, the cabin door opened behind him. Tahia stepped onto the porch, her blind eyes directed unerringly toward the sheriff's voice. She wore one of Mason's old shirts over her dress, the sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. Despite her small stature, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "I have no contact with warriors," she said clearly. "My father sent me here for safety." The sheriff seemed taken aback by her perfect English and direct manner. "Your father, who might that be, miss?" "A man who wants peace," she said simply. "He would not break treaties or harm settlers." The ranch hand spat into the dirt. "That ain't what the dead cattle at Taylor's Creek suggest." Tahia's expression didn't change. "Not all who look Apache are Apache. Not all who claim to want peace truly do." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "You're suggesting someone else killed those cattle? Made it look like Apache work?" "I suggest only that things are not always what they seem." Her blind eyes were steady. "Just as a blind woman is not always helpless." An uncomfortable silence followed. Mason found himself impressed with Tahia's composure in the face of these men's obvious suspicion. She stood straight-backed beside him, neither cowering nor showing anger. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "just wanted to make sure you were all right out here, Reeves, and to warn you to keep an eye out. These are unsettled times." He glanced at Tahia again. "If you hear anything that might help prevent bloodshed, I'd appreciate knowing about it." Mason nodded once. "I'll keep that in mind." After the men rode away, Mason and Tahia remained on the porch, listening to the hoofbeats fade into the distance. A chill wind whipped across the yard, carrying the promise of an early winter. "Your father really is an important man among your people, isn't he?" Mason asked quietly. Tahia turned her face toward him. "Yes, he is what your people would call a chief." The implications of that settled heavily on Mason's shoulders. He wasn't just harboring any Apache woman. He had the daughter of a chief in his home. If trouble was really brewing between settlers and the Apache, that complicated matters considerably. "You should have told me," he said. "Would it have changed your decision to bring me here?" Mason considered this. "No, but I would have liked to know what I was getting into." "We rarely know what we're getting into, Mason Reeves." A small smile touched her lips. "Life is filled with surprises, some good, some bad. The key is to face them with an open heart." With that cryptic statement, she turned and went back inside, leaving Mason to wonder just how many more surprises lay in store for them both. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the eaves of the cabin. Mason added extra wood to the fire, watching as Tahia sat cross-legged on the bed, her fingers working deftly at something in her lap. Looking closer, he saw she was repairing her deerskin dress, the one she'd arrived in. She'd been wearing his old shirts since her arrival, but now she carefully stitched the torn neckline and hem of her own clothing. Beside her lay small beads and shells he hadn't noticed before, arranged in a precise line. "What are those?" he asked, nodding towards the beads before remembering she couldn't see the gesture. "Decorations for my dress," she replied, fingers finding a bead without hesitation. "Each has meaning. This one represents water." She held up a blue bead. "This shell is for the mountains. This pattern tells the story of my family." Mason watched as she threaded each piece back onto the dress, her movements precise and sure. The work was intricate, requiring a dexterity that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see what she was doing. "How do you know where each piece goes?" he asked. "By memory, by feel." Her fingers traced a pattern along the leather. "Each has its place. Does it matter to you? How it looks?" The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. Tahia's hands stilled. "It matters to me that it's mine." She resumed her work. "In your world, I am defined by what I lack. In mine, I am defined by what I carry." The statement hung in the air between them. Mason considered it, recognizing a truth that extended beyond her blindness. Wasn't he too defined by what he lacked? The wife who was gone, the child never born, the happiness he'd once taken for granted. "What happened to your wife, Mason?" Tahia asked suddenly, her voice gentle. Mason stiffened. Though he'd mentioned Rebecca briefly, he rarely spoke of her death. "Fever," he said after a long pause. 5 years ago. You were away when it happened." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "Yes, went to Cheyenne for supplies. 3-day trip." His throat tightened. "When I got back, she was already burning up. Nothing I could do." Tahia's hands continued their steady work. "She was with child." Mason's head snapped up. "How did you know that?" "Your voice changes when you speak of her. There's double grief there. 2 souls lost, not one." He stared at her, unsettled by her perception. "Yes, she was 7 months along, our first. A daughter." This time Mason rose from his chair, heart pounding. "I never told you that." No one knew, not even Rebecca. It was too early to tell. Tahia's blind eyes found him in the darkness, her expression serene. "Some things can be known without being told, Mason Reeves." "How?" The word came out harsher than he intended. "In my tribe, I was trained as a healer. When one sense is lost, others grow stronger." She set aside her sewing. "Sometimes I see things others cannot, feel presences, especially those who haven't found peace." Mason backed away, his rational mind rejecting her words even as a deeper part of him resonated with them. "That's superstition." "Is it?" Her head tilted. "Then how do I know your daughter would have had your blue eyes? How do I know Rebecca sang when she was happy? How do I know she doesn't blame you for not being there when she died?" A chill ran down Mason's spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Stop it. You carry guilt that isn't yours to bear, Mason. It clouds your spirit like a shadow." "I said stop." His voice rose over the sound of the rain. "You don't know anything about Rebecca or me or what happened." Tahia remained calm in the face of his anger. "I know more than you think, and I know Rebecca would want you to forgive yourself." Mason grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "I'm going to check on the horses," he muttered, needing to escape the suddenly stifling confines of the cabin. Outside, the rain soaked him immediately. The wind cut through his coat like a knife, but he welcomed the physical discomfort. It distracted him from the turmoil in his mind. The horses were fine, huddled together at the back of the barn for warmth. Mason stayed anyway, sitting on an overturned bucket, water dripping from his hat and coat. How could Tahia know those things? The color of the baby's eyes, Rebecca's singing, these were private memories he'd shared with no one. And the guilt, the crushing guilt that had been his constant companion for 5 years. The knowledge that if he'd been home instead of in Cheyenne, he might have gotten Rebecca help sooner. might have saved her and their child. He'd carried that burden alone, told no one. Yet Taya had seen it as clearly as if it were written on his skin. When he finally returned to the cabin, soaked to the bone and chilled through, Taya was still awake. She'd added wood to the fire and the room was warm. Without a word, she rose and fetched the towel that hung by the wash basin, offering it to him. Mason took it, drying his face and hair. "Thank you," he said stiffly. "You're welcome." She returned to the bed but didn't lie down. "I'm sorry if I upset you. It wasn't my intention." Mason hung his wet coat by the fire to dry. "How do you know those things about Rebecca?" "Really?" Tahia was quiet for a moment. "When I touch objects people have used, sometimes I sense things about them. Their feelings, memories." She gestured to the cabin around them. "This place is filled with memories of her, of both of you, happy ones from before." "And the baby? How did you know it was a girl?" Sometimes, sometimes I dream of those who have passed on. Not always, but when their spirits are restless." She hesitated. "Your daughter's spirit is still here, Mason. She never had a chance to live, so she lingers." Mason sat heavily in the chair, mind reeling. What Tahia described went against everything his rational mind believed. Yet how else could she know these things? "Why would you tell me this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Because carrying guilt for something you couldn't have changed is a heavy burden, one you've borne too long." She tilted her head, listening to the rain. "Rebecca doesn't blame you. Neither does your daughter." Mason closed his eyes, an unexpected wave of emotion washing over him. For 5 years, he'd believed their deaths were his fault. The thought that Rebecca might not blame him, that the crushing weight of his guilt might be unnecessary, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know if I can believe that," he said finally. "You don't have to decide tonight," Tahia replied gently. "Just know that it's true." She lay down then, pulling the blanket over herself, seemingly content to leave the matter there. Mason remained by the fire long after she fell asleep, listening to the storm and turning her words over in his mind. For the first time in years, a tiny crack appeared in the wall he'd built around his grief, a possibility he'd never considered, that forgiveness might be available to him after all. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, something long frozen in Mason Reeves began, ever so slightly, to thaw. Weeks passed and winter settled over the Wyoming landscape. The first snow fell in early November, covering the ranch in a pristine white blanket that muffled sounds and transformed the familiar into something new. Mason found himself busier than he'd been in years, preparing the ranch for the harsh season ahead. To his surprise, Tahia proved invaluable in these efforts. Her knowledge of natural remedies helped keep the livestock healthy. Her skilled hands repaired harnesses and clothing faster than he could have. And most unexpectedly, her presence in the cabin brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. They settled into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Mason still slept in the chair by the fire, giving Tahia the only bed, but the arrangement no longer felt as awkward as it once had. They spoke more freely now, sharing stories and knowledge as they worked side by side. One morning as they ate breakfast, Mason noticed Tahia's head tilt slightly toward the window, her expression changing. "What is it?" he asked. "Someone's coming," she replied. "One rider." Mason moved to the window, peering through the frost-rimmed glass. A lone figure on horseback approached through the snow, still some distance away. "How did you hear that? I can't even see them clearly yet." A small smile touched her lips. The snow changes sounds, makes them carry differently. Mason watched the rider draw closer, finally recognizing Samuel Reed, the mail carrier who occasionally brought letters and news to the outlying ranches. Reed was a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, bundled against the cold in a heavy coat. "It's just Reed with the mail," Mason said, relaxing slightly. "You don't get many letters," Tahia observed. "No, not anymore." Mason stepped onto the porch as Reed approached, raising a hand in greeting. The mail carrier returned the gesture, reining in his horse. "Morning, Reeves," Reed called. "Got a letter for you. Surprised me, it did." Mason took the envelope, noting the Cheyenne postmark. He didn't recognize the handwriting. "Thanks." Reed remained on his horse, clearly curious. His eyes darted to the cabin door. "Heard you took in that Apache woman from town." That true? Mason's expression hardened. News travels fast. Small territory. People talk. Reed shifted in his saddle. Some folks in town are saying it ain't proper. A white man living with an Indian woman, especially with all the trouble brewing. What trouble? Reed lowered his voice, though there was no one else to hear. Word is Apache hit another ranch yesterday. Wilson's place, about 20 miles south. Burned a barn, ran off some cattle. Mason frowned. Anyone hurt? No, thank the Lord. Family was in town when it happened. Reed glanced nervously at the surrounding countryside. Some folks are saying it's just the beginning, that the Apache are testing defenses before something bigger. And what do you think? Reed shrugged. Don't rightly know, but I'd watch my back if I were you, Reeves. That woman— Taya, Mason interrupted. Her name is Taya. Right, well, some folks think she might be passing information, signaling to her people somehow. Mason's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. She's blind, Reed. Maybe so, but blind don't mean deaf or dumb, and Indians have ways. He trailed off as the cabin door opened. Taya stepped onto the porch, her blind eyes directed unerringly toward Reed. Good morning, Mr. Reed, she said clearly. Reed startled visibly. Morning, miss. The coffee is hot if you'd like to warm yourself before continuing your route. The mail carrier glanced at Mason, clearly uncomfortable. That's kind, but I've got many stops ahead. Best be moving on. He gathered his reins. Good day to you both. As Reed rode away, Mason turned the letter over in his hands, still puzzled by its arrival. I haven't gotten mail in over a year, he said. Perhaps it's important news, Taya suggested. Mason broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside. As he read, his expression grew grim. What is it? Taya asked, sensing the change in his demeanor. It's from an old friend in Cheyenne. Army's sending a detachment to deal with the Apache problem, as they're calling it. He folded the letter. Captain Harrison Walsh is leading it. You know this man? Mason's voice hardened. I know him, served under him briefly during the war. He's not a man who values peace. Tahia's face remained composed, but her hands tightened slightly in the folds of her dress. What will he do? Whatever he thinks necessary to force the Apache onto the reservation. Walsh doesn't distinguish between hostiles and friendlies. Mason looked at her. Your father should be warned. There's no way to reach him, she said quietly. And even if there were, he already knows trouble is coming. It's why he sent me away. Mason pocketed the letter, his mind working through the implications. If Walsh was coming, the situation was more serious than he'd thought. The captain had a reputation for brutal efficiency and little concern for distinguishing innocent from guilty. We should prepare, he said finally. Stock up on supplies. Make sure we can weather whatever's coming. Taya nodded, her expression solemn. Yes, winter will be long this year, in more ways than one. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Mason sat by the fire repairing a bridle. Taya was at the table grinding herbs she'd dried weeks earlier, the pungent scent filling the cabin. Neither had spoken much since Reed's visit, both lost in their own thoughts. Tell me about your father, Mason said suddenly, breaking the silence. Tahia's hands stilled momentarily. What do you want to know? What kind of man is he? Would he order attacks on ranches? She resumed her work, fingers moving methodically over the herbs. My father is called Running Bear. He has led our band for 15 summers. He is wise, respected. She paused. And no, he would not order attacks on peaceful settlers. He believes in finding a way to live alongside the white man. Then who's responsible for the raids? There are young warriors who disagree with his path. They see accommodation as weakness. And there are others, she hesitated. Others? Those who would benefit from conflict. Not all who appear to be Apache are friends to the Apache. Mason frowned, considering this. You're saying some of the attacks might be staged to provoke a response? It wouldn't be the first time. Her blind eyes turned toward him. History is written by those who survive, Mason, and sometimes the truth is buried with the dead. The statement hung heavy in the air between them. Mason thought of Walsh, of the methods he'd seen the man employ during the war. Creating a pretext for military action would not be beyond him. If that's true, he said slowly, then Walsh's arrival will only make things worse. Yes. Taya set aside her mortar and pestle. More blood will be spilled, on both sides. Mason leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He'd left that world behind after the war, the politics, the violence, the moral compromises. He'd wanted nothing more than to live quietly with Rebecca, to build something that had nothing to do with destruction. Now it seemed the world had found him again. "What will you do when Walsh arrives?" Tahia asked, her voice gentle. "I don't know." Mason set the bridle aside. "I've spent 5 years avoiding everyone and everything, keeping to myself. And has that brought you peace, Famasu?" The question struck at something deep within him. Had his isolation healed anything? Or had it merely allowed his wounds to fester in private? "No," he admitted, "it hasn't." Tahia moved from the table to sit near him by the fire. Despite her blindness, she navigated the small space with perfect confidence now. "There is a saying among my people," she said. "The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. You have been a lone wolf too long, Mason Reeves." He looked at her, struck by how the firelight played across her features, highlighting the quiet strength there. In the weeks since her arrival, Tahia had transformed from a burden he'd reluctantly accepted to, what, a friend? Something more. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything else anymore," he said. "Yes, you do." Her voice was soft but certain. "It's still inside you. The man who built this ranch with love. The man who signed those papers in town not because you wanted something from me, but because you couldn't stand to see suffering." Mason swallowed hard, her words touching a part of himself he'd long ignored. "You give me too much credit, and you give yourself too little." They sat in silence then, the fire crackling between them, each lost in thought. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white. Inside, something shifted between them, a recognition that they were no longer simply two strangers bound by circumstance, but something more complex and harder to define. Morning broke clear and cold, the world transformed by the night's snowfall. Mason rose early, his body stiff from another night in the chair. Tahia was already awake, tending the fire with practiced ease. "I need to check the north pasture," he said after breakfast. "Make sure the cattle found shelter during the storm." Tahia nodded. "The temperature has dropped further. Take the heavy coat." Mason smiled slightly at her concern. "I will. I shouldn't be more than a few hours." He bundled up against the cold and set out on horseback, the snow crunching beneath the mare's hooves. The north pasture lay beyond a small rise, partially sheltered by a stand of pine trees. It was where he kept the majority of his small herd during winter. As he crested the rise, Mason pulled up sharply. In the valley below, where his cattle should have been gathered near the windbreak he'd built, there was nothing. The animals were gone. Frowning, he spurred his horse forward, scanning the snow for tracks. He found them quickly, hoofprints from multiple riders, along with the scattered tracks of his cattle being driven off. The trail led west toward the foothills. Mason followed the tracks for nearly a mile, his concern growing. This was no random theft. The cattle had been deliberately rounded up and driven away. But by whom? The answer came when he found a single arrow embedded in a tree trunk along the trail. It was fletched in the Apache style, with distinctive markings on the shaft. Or at least, it appeared to be Apache. Mason studied it carefully, remembering Tahia's words. "Not all who appear to be Apache are friends to the Apache." He pulled the arrow free and tucked it inside his coat. Whether genuine or planted, it was evidence of something larger at work. Mason turned his horse back toward the ranch, mind racing with implications. When he returned to the cabin, he found Tahia waiting anxiously on the porch, alerted by the sound of his approach. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted. "You're back too soon. The cattle are gone, all of them." Mason led his horse to the barn, Tahia following close behind. "Someone took them during the night." "Who?" Mason removed his saddle, his movements sharp with anger. "Whoever did it left an Apache arrow behind, making sure I'd know who to blame." Tahia was silent for a moment. "May I feel it?" Mason removed the arrow from his coat and placed it in her outstretched hand. Her fingers moved delicately over the shaft, examining the fletching and markings. "This is not from my people," she said finally. "The markings are wrong. Someone made this to look Apache, but the pattern is meaningless. Just lines where there should be symbols." Mason took the arrow back, studying it again with new eyes. "Could be someone doesn't know the difference. Or hopes you don't." Tahia's expression was grim. This is happening at many ranches, isn't it? Creating fear, anger toward my people. Seems that way. Mason leaned against the barn wall, suddenly tired. The question is, why? Who benefits from starting a war? Those who want what my people still have. Land, gold, the freedom to live without answering to the white man's laws. She turned her face toward the distant mountains, and those like your Captain Walsh, who build their reputation on the bodies of others. Mason couldn't argue with her assessment. He'd seen it before, how conflict could be manufactured to serve the interests of a few, while those caught in the middle paid the price. What will you do? Tehia asked. He sighed heavily. For now, nothing. The cattle are gone. Chasing after them alone would be foolish. But you're angry. Yes. He didn't bother denying it. Those cattle were everything I had. Without them, you're just a man on a piece of land, she finished for him. Like my father without his hunting grounds. Like my people without their freedom. And the parallel wasn't lost on Mason. For the first time, he truly understood what Tehia's people faced. The systematic stripping away of everything that allowed self-sufficiency and independence. Come inside, she said gently, touching his arm. The day grows colder. They returned to the cabin, but the peace they'd found in recent days was gone, replaced by a tension neither could fully articulate. Mason paced while Tehia sat quietly by the fire, her expression thoughtful. What if you spoke to Sheriff Logan, she suggested finally. Told him about the false arrow? Mason shook his head. Logan's a decent man in his way, but he's not one to question the obvious answer. Even if he believed me, what could he do? The tracks are already being covered by new snow. Then we wait, and we watch. Tehia's voice was steady. And when the time comes to stand for what's right, we will know. Mason looked at her, struck by the quiet determination in her face. We? A small smile curved her lips. Yes, Mason Reeves, we. 3 days later, as Mason chopped wood behind the cabin, he heard riders approaching once more. This time, it was a larger group, 5 or 6 horses from the sound of it. He set down his axe and moved to the front of the cabin, just as Sheriff Logan and 4 other men rode into the yard. Among them was Henry Wilson, whose ranch had supposedly been attacked by Apache. Reeves, Logan called, dismounting. Need to have a word. Mason stood on the porch, watching as the men spread out slightly, their posture suggesting this was more than a social call. What about? Your cattle gone missing? You know they have, Mason replied, having reported the theft the day before when he'd gone into town for supplies. Logan nodded grimly. Same as the Carters, same as the Wilsons here, all with Apache signs left behind. Wilson stepped forward, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl. My barn was burned to the ground, Reeves. Could have been my family if we'd been home. I'm sorry to hear that, Mason said evenly, but I don't see what it has to do with me. Logan's gaze shifted to the cabin door. It has to do with your house guest. Word is, she's the daughter of an Apache chief. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? Before Mason could answer, the cabin door opened, and Tehia stepped out. She wore her deerskin dress now, fully repaired and adorned with the beads and shells that told her family story. Her hair was braided in the traditional Apache style, and she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Yes, she said clearly, my father is Running Bear, leader of our band, but he has no part in these attacks. Wilson spat in the snow. Like hell he doesn't. Who else would it be? Perhaps those who want his land, Tehia suggested calmly. Those who know the army will move against my people if enough settlers demand it. Logan frowned. That's quite an accusation, miss. You have any proof? The arrow left at Mason's ranch is not Apache. The markings are wrong. It was made to deceive. The men exchanged glances, skepticism clear on their faces. Mason stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Tehia. I've seen real Apache arrows, he said. This one's different. Someone wants us to think it's Apache work. And why would anyone do that? Wilson demanded. What's to gain? The reservation sits on good land, Mason pointed out. Land that would be open for settlement if the Apache were removed or exterminated. A tense silence followed his words. Mason could see the doubt in Logan's eyes, but also a reluctance to consider alternatives to the obvious explanation. Captain Walsh arrives tomorrow with a detachment of cavalry. the sheriff said finally. He's been authorized to deal with the Apache threat. I suggest you turn the woman over to us now, Reeves. For her own protection, if nothing else. Protection? Mason's voice hardened. You mean as a hostage, to use against her father? Logan didn't deny it. War's coming, whether we like it or not. When it does, you'll need to decide which side you're on. I'm not on any side, Mason replied, and neither is Taya. She came here for sanctuary, and that's what she'll get. Wilson stepped forward menacingly. You choosing Indians over your own kind, Reeves? I'm choosing what's right over what's easy. Mason's hand drifted toward the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. Now I think you men should leave. For a moment it seemed the confrontation might escalate further. Then Logan raised a hand, gesturing his companions back. Think about what you're doing, Reeves. Walsh won't be as patient as I am. I've met Walsh, Mason said grimly. I know exactly what he's capable of. Logan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Your choice then, but don't say you weren't warned. As the men rode away, Mason and Tahia remained on the porch, watching until they disappeared from sight. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, the beauty of the landscape at odds with the ugliness of the confrontation. They'll be back, Tahia said quietly, with more men. I know. Mason turned to her. You should go. Find a way back to your people. No. Her blind eyes found his face with unerring accuracy. I won't leave you to face this alone. Tahia, I know what they'll do, she interrupted. To me, to my people, to anyone who stands in their way. She reached out, finding his hand with her own, but I will not run from what must be faced. Her fingers were warm despite the cold air, her grip surprisingly strong. Mason looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, serene despite the danger, determined despite her vulnerability. In that moment, something shifted within him. The wall he'd built around his heart after Rebecca's death cracked further, letting in a warmth he'd thought never to feel again. Then we face it together, he said, squeezing her hand gently. Whatever comes. That night, as wind howled around the cabin, Mason and Taya prepared as best they could for what lay ahead. Mason cleaned his rifle and revolver, checking his limited supply of ammunition. Taya packed dried food and medicine into small bundles that could be quickly grabbed. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was companionable rather than tense. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who had learned each other's rhythms. As Mason stoked the fire one last time before attempting sleep, Tahia sat cross-legged on the bed, her expression thoughtful. What are you thinking? He asked. About paths, she replied. How they cross, diverge, come together again. How some are chosen while others are forced upon us. Like your path bringing you here? She smiled slightly. Yes, and yours keeping you here alone all these years. Mason settled into his chair, stretching his legs toward the fire's warmth. I chose solitude, he said. After Rebecca died, being around others was painful. Every happy family, every couple, every child, they all reminded me of what I'd lost. So you closed yourself off, built walls. It seemed easier than feeling the pain. And was it? Mason considered this. For a time. But walls keep everything out, not just pain. Eventually I was just empty. Tahia nodded, understanding in her expression. Among my people, grief is not born alone. When someone dies, the entire tribe shares the burden. We believe isolation is the enemy of healing. Your people are wiser than mine then, Mason said with a rueful smile. Not wiser, just different. She tilted her head. You've started to heal, though. I can hear it in your voice. He looked at her, surprised. Have I? Yes. You speak of Rebecca with love now, not just pain. You remember the good, not only the loss. Mason realized she was right. In recent weeks, when thoughts of Rebecca came to him, they were as likely to bring a smile as a pang of grief. He remembered her laugh, her strength, the way she'd loved this land as much as he did. The memories remained, but the jagged edges of loss had begun to smooth. I have you to thank for that, he said quietly. Tahia shook her head. No, Mason. The healing was always within you. You just needed to find the path back to it. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind's mournful song outside. Mason found himself studying Tahia's face in the firelight, the gentle curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in her expression, the clouded eyes that somehow saw more clearly than most. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly, "when this is over?" The question caught him off guard. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Perhaps you should." Her voice was soft. "Paths don't end with one journey. They continue, leading to new places." "And what about your path?" he countered. "Will you return to your people when it's safe?" Taya was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "I found something here I didn't expect." "What's that?" Her blind eyes turned toward him. "A place where I'm not defined by what I lack, but by what I can offer." She paused. "And someone who sees me, even though I cannot see him." The simple honesty of her words touched something deep within Mason. In all the years since Rebecca's death, he'd never imagined finding a connection with anyone else. Yet here, in the most unlikely of circumstances, with the most unexpected of companions, something had grown between them that couldn't be easily defined or dismissed. "I see you, Tahia," he said softly. "I do." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I know, Mason Reeves. I know." Later, as they prepared for sleep, Tahia on the bed, Mason in his chair by the fire, she spoke again, her voice drifting through the darkness. "Mason, yes? No matter what happens tomorrow or the days after, I want you to know something." He turned toward her voice. "What's that?" "The time I've spent here, with you, it's been good. Better than I expected when my father sent me away." She paused. "I wouldn't trade it, even for safety." Mason sat with her words, feeling their weight in truth. "Neither would I, Tahia. Neither would I." Outside, the wind continued its mournful cry, carrying the promise of more snow. Inside, two souls once isolated now found strength in their unexpected bond, preparing to face whatever morning might bring. Dawn broke gray and still, the storm having passed in the night. Mason rose early, his body protesting another night in the chair. Taya was already awake, her acute hearing having caught the sound of approaching riders long before they were visible. "At least 6 horses," she said quietly, "coming from the east." Mason moved to the window, rifle in hand. Through the frost-rimmed glass, he could make out a group of riders approaching. At their head rode a figure he recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed. Captain Harrison Walsh, his posture rigid in the saddle, his uniform immaculate even on the frontier. "It's Walsh," Mason confirmed grimly, "with 5 soldiers." Tahia stood near the table, her expression composed but her hands betraying tension as they gripped the back of a chair. "What will you do?" Mason considered their options, none of them good. He could refuse to let them take Tahia, but that would likely end with both of them dead. He could try to flee, but the fresh snow would make their tracks easy to follow. Or he could try to reason with Walsh, perhaps the least likely to succeed given what he knew of the man. "I'll talk to him he decided. "Try to buy time." Tahia nodded, accepting his decision. "Be careful, Mason. Men like Walsh hear only what they wish to hear." Mason checked his revolver, tucking it into his belt before stepping onto the porch. The morning air bit at his exposed skin, the temperature well below freezing. He stood tall as the riders approached, determined not to show any sign of fear. Walsh reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, signaling his men to spread out in a loose semicircle. The captain had aged since Mason had last seen him, his mustache now more gray than brown, lines etched deeply around his eyes. But his bearing remained the same, arrogant, certain, dangerous. "Reeves," Walsh called, his voice carrying in the still air. "Been a long time." "Not long enough, Captain," Mason replied evenly. A thin smile played at Walsh's lips. "Still holding grudges, I see. Some things never change." He surveyed the ranch with obvious contempt. "Though some things do. Never figured you for a man to take up with an Indian woman." Mason's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Walsh?" "Straight to business. I can respect that." Walsh straightened in his saddle. "I want the Apache woman. Sheriff Logan tells me she's the daughter of Running Bear. She'll make a valuable bargaining chip." "She's not a chip. She's a person who came here for sanctuary." "Sanctuary?" Walsh laughed coldly. "Is that what you call it? While her people raid ranches, burn buildings, steal cattle. It wasn't her people, Mason said. The attacks were staged. Walsh raised an eyebrow. Staged? By whom? Someone who wants to provoke a war, someone who stands to benefit from driving the Apache off their land. That's quite an accusation, Reeves. You have proof? Mason hesitated. The false arrow wasn't enough. Any competent liar could claim it was planted to create doubt. I thought not, Walsh said, reading his silence correctly. Now, are you going to turn over the woman, or do my men need to come in and get her? Before Mason could answer, the cabin door opened, and Tahia stepped onto the porch. She stood tall, her chin lifted, facing Walsh with unflinching dignity despite her blindness. I am Tahia, daughter of Running Bear, she said clearly. I speak for myself, Captain Walsh. Walsh studied her with cold interest. So you know who I am. I know what you are, she corrected. A man who builds his reputation on the suffering of others. A murmur ran through the soldiers at her boldness. Walsh's expression hardened. Careful, woman. Your father's not here to protect you. I don't need protection from words, only from actions. Her blind eyes seemed to find him unerringly. Like the actions of men who dress as Apache to attack settlers, men who create fear to serve their own interests. Walsh's face remained impassive, but Mason caught a flicker in his eyes, not surprise, but calculation. That's a convenient story, the captain said. Unfortunately, the evidence says otherwise. The Army has orders to deal with the Apache threat, and your father's band is at the top of the list. Because you put them there, Mason interjected, just like you engineered evidence against innocent men during the war. Walsh turned to him, something dangerous glinting in his eyes. Still bitter about that business with Sergeant Miller, are you? He was a deserter, Reeves. He got what he deserved. He was innocent, and you knew it, just like you know the Apache aren't responsible for these attacks. A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. Mason was acutely aware of the soldiers' hands resting on their weapons, of Tahia standing vulnerably beside him, of how easily this could end in bloodshed. I'm going to make this simple, Walsh said finally. The woman comes with us, now, or I'll have my men burn this place to the ground with both of you inside. Mason's hand moved toward the revolver at his belt, but Tahia's fingers caught his wrist, stopping him. No, she said softly, there's no need for more violence. She turned her face toward Walsh. I will go with you, Captain, on one condition. Walsh smirked. You're not in a position to make conditions. Nevertheless, I make one. Mason Reeves is not to be harmed. Her voice was steady, determined. Swear it, as an officer of the United States Army. Something like respect flickered briefly across Walsh's face. Very well, Reeves will not be harmed, as long as he stays out of Army business from now on. Mason grabbed Tahia's arm. You can't go with him. You know what he'll do. She turned to him, her expression gentle but resolute. I know, but this is the path I must walk now. Her hand found his face, fingers brushing lightly along his jaw. Remember what I told you about paths, Mason. They cross, diverge, come together again. The touch of her fingers against his skin carried more meaning than words could express. A promise, a farewell. Perhaps both. Time's wasting, Walsh called impatiently. Let's go. Tahia turned from Mason and descended the porch steps, her movements careful but dignified. One of the soldiers dismounted to help her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. This isn't over, Walsh, Mason called, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The captain merely smiled. It is for you, Reeves. Stay on your ranch and lick your wounds. It's what you do best. He turned his horse. Move out. Mason watched helplessly as they rode away, Tahia's straight back gradually disappearing into the distance. Only when they were out of sight did he allow his composure to crack, his fist slamming into the porch post with enough force to splinter the wood. Inside the cabin, the emptiness was immediate and overwhelming. Tahia's presence had filled the space in ways Mason hadn't fully appreciated until now. Her scent lingered in the air. Her few possessions remained where she'd left them. The mortar and pestle on the shelf, the small pouch of healing herbs by the bed. Mason sat heavily in his chair, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Walsh had Tahia. He would use her to force Running Bear's surrender, or, failing that, as bait to lure the Apache into a trap. Either way, people would die. Good people, innocent people. And Mason had done nothing to stop it. The realization burned in his chest like acid. For 5 years, he'd done nothing while life passed him by, nursing his grief like a cherished possession. Then Taya had arrived, bringing light into his darkness, showing him a way forward. And at the first real test, he'd failed her. No, not again. He would not lose someone else he cared for without fighting for them. Mason rose, determination replacing despair. Walsh had taken Taya, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He gathered his rifle, ammunition, and provisions, mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't face Walsh and his soldiers alone. That would be suicide. He needed allies, information, a plan. As he prepared to leave, Mason's gaze fell on Tahia's repaired dress hanging by the fire, the one she'd arrived in, now carefully mended with its beads and shells restored. He touched it gently, remembering her words. "It matters to me that it's mine." He folded the dress carefully and placed it in his saddlebag. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he would make sure she got it back. It was a promise to himself and to her. Outside, the morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Mason mounted his horse, taking one last look at the cabin, the home that had been his prison and his sanctuary, now empty once more. But this time, he wasn't retreating from the world. He was riding toward it with purpose and determination. To save Taya, to stop Walsh, to finally step back into the light after years in shadow. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But for the first time in 5 years, Mason Reeves knew exactly where he needed to go. The sun hung low in the western sky as Mason Reeves rode into Pine Ridge. The town looked different now, threatening rather than merely unwelcoming. A few people moved along the boardwalks, casting curious glances his way before hurrying on. News traveled fast in Wyoming territory, and everyone would know by now that the Apache woman had been taken from his ranch. Mason tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, his movements deliberate. He checked his revolver one last time before pushing through the door, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. Sheriff Logan sat at his desk, hat pushed back on his head, a ledger open before him. He looked up as Mason entered, surprise quickly replaced by wariness. "Reeves," he acknowledged, "didn't expect to see you in town." "Where did Walsh take her?" Mason asked without a preamble. Logan sighed, closing the ledger. "You know I can't tell you that, even if I wanted to. They'll kill her, Logan, or worse. It's Army business now." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Nothing you or I can do about it." Mason placed his palms on the desk, leaning forward. "You're smarter than this, Sheriff. You know something's not right about these attacks. The timing, the evidence left behind, it's too perfect." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Logan's face. "I admit some things don't add up. But that doesn't mean... It means innocent people will die because it's convenient for men like Walsh." Mason straightened. "I need to know where they took her." Logan studied him for a long moment. "Why do you care so much about this woman, Reeves? Few weeks ago, you barely spoke to another soul. Now you're ready to take on the U.S. Army for an Apache girl?" It was a fair question, one Mason had asked himself during the long ride to town. The answer had come to him gradually, like the slow melting of ice in spring. "Because she saw me," he said simply. "When I was invisible to everyone, including myself. And now she needs someone to see her." Understanding dawned in Logan's eyes, followed by something like resignation. "Army set up camp at Willow Creek, old trading post site, about 15 miles west of here." He paused. "Walsh sent a messenger to Running Bear's band, demanded they come in peacefully or he'd take appropriate action. Which means he's spoiling for a fight with or without provocation." Logan lowered his voice. "There's something else. One of my deputies found tracks near the Wilson place after the raid. Army boots, not moccasins." Mason's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Walsh is creating pretext for an attack. "I didn't say that," Logan replied quickly, "but I'm not entirely convinced these raids are Apache work." It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall of certainty that Walsh was trying to build. "What are you planning, Reeves?" Logan asked, watching him closely. "Better you don't know." Mason moved toward the door. "But if you want to prevent a massacre, keep your men alert. Things might happen fast." Outside, the temperature was dropping as night approached. Mason mounted his horse, mind working through his next move. Willow Creek was at least 3 hours' ride, and he'd need allies if he had any hope of helping Tahia. His first thought was Samuel Reed, the mail carrier. The man traveled extensively throughout the territory and might have valuable information. More importantly, he seemed less convinced than most about the Apache's guilt. Mason found Reed at the livery stable preparing for his next day's route. "Reed," he called, dismounting. The mail carrier looked up, startled. "Reeves? Heard they took that woman from your place." "They did. I need your help." Reed glanced around nervously. "Don't want trouble with the army, Reeves." "I'm not asking you to fight," Mason assured him. "Just to talk. What have you heard about these attacks? The real story, not what folks are saying in town." Reed hesitated, then sighed. "Been noticing things on my routes. Tracks where they shouldn't be. Men who ain't settlers or Apache moving through the territory." He lowered his voice. "And there's talk about land speculators from back east. Men with connections to the railroad. They've been buying up options on property all around the reservation." "Options that only have value if the Apache are gone," Mason concluded. "Exactly." Reed adjusted his saddlebags. "There's something else. A group of men's been camping near Taylor's Creek for weeks now. Not settlers, not hunters. Keep to themselves. One of them, big fellow with a scar across his cheek. I saw him talking to Walsh yesterday morning." "Before Walsh came to my ranch," Mason noted. "You think these men are behind the raids?" "Can't say for certain, but they ain't who they claim to be, that's for sure." Mason nodded, pieces falling into place. "Anyone else in town might help? Someone not afraid of Walsh?" Reed thought for a moment. "Try Margaret Wilson at the general store. She's not one to be bullied, even by the army. And she's got no love for Walsh after what happened to her nephew during the war." "What happened?" "Court-martial on false charges. Walsh's testimony sent him to prison. Boy died there." Reed shook his head. "Margaret's never forgotten, never forgiven either." It was another piece of the puzzle. Walsh's history of fabricating evidence to achieve his ends, regardless of who suffered. "Thanks, Reed," Mason said, turning to go. "Reeves," the mail carrier called after him, "be careful. Walsh isn't a man who leaves loose ends." The general store was nearly empty when Mason entered, just Margaret Wilson behind the counter and a young clerk stocking shelves. The widow Wilson was a formidable woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, posture straight as a ramrod despite her years. She looked up as the bell above the door announced his entrance, her expression sharpening with recognition. "Mason Reeves," she said, "didn't expect to see you twice in 1 month, let alone one day." "Mrs. Wilson," he nodded, "need to talk to you privately." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she gestured toward the back room. "Timothy, mind the counter," she instructed the clerk, before leading Mason through a doorway hung with a heavy curtain. The back room was warm, a small stove burning in one corner, shelves lined with inventory. Margaret Wilson closed the curtain and turned to face him, arms crossed. "This about your Apache woman, I presume?" "Yes." "And you think I might help because—" "Because you know what kind of man Harrison Walsh is," Mason replied. "What he's capable of." Something flickered in her eyes, an old pain, sharp as the day it was born. "My nephew was a good boy, never deserved what happened to him." "No," Mason agreed, "he didn't." She studied him for a long moment. "What exactly are you planning, Reeves? And don't tell me you're just going to talk sense into Walsh. Men like him don't listen to reason." "I need to warn Tahia's people about what's coming, and I need proof of who's really behind these attacks." Margaret nodded slowly. "Ambitious and dangerous." She moved to a trunk into the corner, unlocking it with a key from around her neck. "I've been keeping my own record of these Apache raids. Times, locations, what was taken or destroyed." She withdrew a leather-bound journal and handed it to Mason. He flipped through it, noting her precise handwriting and detailed observations. "The pattern's there if you know what to look for," she continued. "All the attacks happen when folks are away from their property. Nothing of real value is ever taken, just enough to cause, not financial ruin, and they always leave obvious Apache evidence behind." "Too obvious," Mason agreed. "Exactly." She took back the journal, turning to a specific page. There's something else. 3 days before the attack started, a man named Victor Harlow arrived in town. Claims to be a land investor from Chicago. Had several meetings with Walsh at the hotel. The same Harlow that Reed saw camped at Taylor's Creek? Margaret looked surprised. Reed's have been watching them too? Good, yes, the same man. He's got 4 or 5 rough sorts with him. Hired guns, if I had to guess. Mason absorbed this information, the pieces coming together. Land speculators working with Walsh to drive the Apache off their territory, staging raids to justify military action. It made perfect, terrible sense. I need to get to Willow Creek, he said. Tonight. Walsh has at least 20 men there, Margaret warned. What do you think one man can do against those odds? Whatever I have to. She studied him, then nodded once, decision made. Wait here. She disappeared through another door, returning moments later with a folded paper. Map of the area around Willow Creek, she explained. Shows paths the Army doesn't know about. Old trapping routes my husband used. She hesitated, then added, There's a group of men staying at the old Miller homestead, about 3 miles east of here. Friends of my nephew. They have no love for Walsh either. Mason took the map, understanding her meaning. Potential allies if he could convince them to help. Thank you, he said simply. Margaret Wilson's expression was grim. Don't thank me. Just make sure Walsh gets what's coming to him. The Miller homestead was a small cluster of buildings nestled in a stand of pine trees, hidden from the main trail. As Mason approached, he was acutely aware of being watched, though he could see no one. That's far enough, a voice called from the darkness. Mason reined in his horse, raising his hand slowly to show he was no threat. Margaret Wilson sent me. I'm looking for friends of James Miller. Silence stretched for several seconds. Then a tall figure stepped from the shadows, rifle held ready, but not aimed directly at Mason. Get down, slow, the man instructed. Mason complied, keeping his movements deliberate. The man approached, studying him in the moonlight. You're Reeves, the rancher. It wasn't a question. Yes. Heard you took in an Apache woman. Heard Walsh took her today. That's why I'm here, Mason confirmed. I need help. The man considered this, then nodded toward the main cabin. Come on, but keep your hands where I can see them. Inside the cabin, 4 more men were gathered around a rough-hewn table. They looked up as Mason entered, expressions varying from curious to hostile. This is Reeves, his escort announced. Margaret sent him. The oldest of the group, a gray-bearded man with a deep scar running from temple to jaw, stood. I'm Daniel Taylor. These are my sons, John and William. He nodded to 2 younger men who shared his features. That's Caleb Porter by the fire, and the suspicious one who brought you in is Michael Green. Mason Reeves, Mason replied, though they clearly already knew who he was. Sit, Taylor gestured to an empty chair. Tell us why Margaret sent you our way. Mason sat, aware of the careful scrutiny of every man in the room. I need to get to Willow Creek. Walsh is holding a woman there, Taya, daughter of Running Bear. He plans to use her to force the Apache onto the reservation, or, failing that, as an excuse for military action. Why should we care about some Apache woman? One of the younger Taylors asked. Because she's innocent, and because Walsh is the same man who falsely accused James Miller during the war. Mason looked directly at the elder Taylor. You fought with Miller, didn't you? Taylor's expression hardened. He was my lieutenant, best officer I ever served under. Walsh destroyed him with lies because Miller reported his brutality towards civilians. Walsh is doing the same thing now, Mason explained, staging raids on settlers, blaming the Apache, creating a pretext for attacking the reservation. There's a man named Harlow involved, land speculator, with hired guns. Michael Green spoke up from near the door. We've seen Harlow's men, tracked them after the raid on the Wilson place. They're camped at Taylor's Creek, like they're waiting for something. They're waiting for Walsh to provoke the Apache into retaliation, Mason said. Then they'll have their excuse for a full military response. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication born of long association. What exactly are you proposing, Reeves? Taylor asked finally. I need to get Tahia out of that camp, and I need proof of what Walsh and Harlow are planning, something concrete enough to take to the territorial governor. Breaking a prisoner out of an army camp is a hanging offense, Porter observed from his place by the fire. Even if we succeed, we'd be outlaws. I'm not asking any of you to come with me, Mason clarified. Just for information, maybe a diversion. Taylor studied him thoughtfully. You'd risk your life for this woman? The question hung in the air, demanding honesty. Mason thought of Taya, her quiet strength, her perception, the way she'd brought light back into his darkness. Yes, he said simply, I would. Something in his tone must have convinced Taylor, for the older man nodded slowly. James would have done the same. He never could abide injustice, especially when wrapped in the flag. He turned to the others. Michael, John, show Reeves what we found at the Wilson place. Green retrieved a bundle from a trunk in the corner, unwrapping it on the table. Inside were several arrows, similar to the one Mason had found at his ranch, along with a cavalry jacket with the insignia removed. Army jacket, Green explained. Found it hidden under a fallen tree near where the barn was burned. These arrows were scattered around, not shot, just placed to be found. Mason examined one of the arrows. Same as the one at my ranch. False markings. We've been gathering evidence for weeks, Taylor said. Not enough to convince the territorial governor yet, but getting there. Walsh won't wait, Mason pointed out. He's moving now. Taylor nodded grimly. Then so must we. He unfolded a map similar to the one Margaret had provided. Willow Creek Trading Post is here. Armies camped in these fields to the north. There's a road along the creek bed that could get you close without being seen. Guards? 2 at each approach road, more around the main building as they're holding your woman in the old storeroom, according to what we've heard. Mason studied the map, memorizing the layout. I'll need a diversion, something to draw attention away from that side of the camp. The men looked at each other again, some silent communication passing between them. We could provide that, Green offered. Fire in the hills to the south would pull most of them away, make them think it's an Apache attack. No shooting, Mason insisted. I don't want anyone hurt if it can be avoided. Taylor nodded approval. Just fire and shadow, enough to keep them busy while you get the woman out. They spent the next hour planning, considering approaches and potential problems. Mason was impressed with their thoroughness. These were clearly men with military experience, used to thinking through operations. What about after? Porter asked as they finalized details. Where will you take her? It was a question Mason had wrestled with since leaving his ranch. There's an old trapper's cabin in the high country, north of my place. We can hide there while I figure out how to get word to her father. And the proof against Walsh? If I can get into his quarters, he might have correspondence with Harlow or orders that show his true intentions. Taylor looked skeptical. That's a lot to hope for, Reeves. I know, but I have to try. As the planning concluded, Taylor pulled Mason aside while the others prepared supplies. You understand what you're doing, son? The older man asked quietly. Even if you succeed tonight, Walsh won't stop. Men like him never do. I know, Mason acknowledged. Then you need to be prepared to go all the way. No half measures. Taylor's scarred face was grave. I've seen what happens when evil men are merely inconvenienced rather than stopped. Mason understood his meaning. I'll do what's necessary. Taylor studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw. We'll move out in 1 hour. That should put us in position by midnight. As Mason checked his gear one last time, he found himself thinking of Rebecca. What would she think of what he was about to do? Of the woman he was risking everything to save? Strangely, he felt no conflict, no sense of betrayal. Instead, he felt a certainty that Rebecca would have understood, would have approved of his standing against injustice, of finding purpose again. I'm living again, Rebecca, he thought. Not just surviving, and that, he knew, was what she would have wanted most for him. The night was moonless, clouds obscuring the stars, perfect conditions for their plan. Mason crouched in the creek bed 100 yards from the Willow Creek Trading Post, watching the army camp through the darkness. Fires burned at intervals, illuminating sentries positioned as Taylor had described. The old trading post consisted of several buildings, a main structure, a stable, and what had once been a storeroom. According to Green, that was where Tahia was being held, guarded by a single soldier. Mason checked his pocket watch. Nearly midnight. The diversion should begin in any moment. As if on cue, a flicker of light appeared on the hillside to the south, quickly growing into a substantial fire. Shouts arose from the camp as soldiers spotted the blaze. More fires ignited along the ridge, creating the impression of multiple campfires. an Apache war party preparing to attack. The response was immediate. Orders were shouted, men scrambled for weapons, horses were saddled. Within minutes, most of the camp was mobilizing toward the southern ridge, leaving only a minimal guard behind. Mason waited until the chaos peaked, then moved forward, keeping low along the creek bed. The guard at the storeroom remained at his post, rifle ready, attention divided between his duty and the commotion to the south. Drawing his knife, Mason approached from behind, moving from shadow to shadow until he was within striking distance. He had no desire to kill the young soldier, merely to incapacitate him long enough to free Tehia. The opportunity came when a particularly loud shout from the southern perimeter drew the guard's attention. Mason closed the distance in 3 quick strides, bringing the knife handle down hard at the base of the soldier's skull. The young man crumpled without a sound. Mason dragged him into the shadows, checking to ensure he was merely unconscious before taking the keys from his belt. The storeroom door was secured with a heavy padlock, which the largest key opened with a quiet click. Inside, the space was dark except for a sliver of moonlight through a small window. Mason could make out a figure huddled in the corner. "Tehia," he called softly. The figure stirred, then rose quickly. "Mason?" Her voice, though hushed, held a mixture of surprise and something else, hope, perhaps. Mason crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Are you hurt?" "No," she assured him. "But why are you here?" No time," he interrupted gently. "We need to move now, while they're distracted." He led her to the door, explaining in whispers about the diversion and the creek bed route. Tehia listened intently, her grip on his hand firm. "Walsh will pursue us," she warned. "He needs me to control my father." "Let me worry about Walsh," Mason replied. "Right now, we just need to get away from here." They slipped from the storeroom, Mason guiding Tehia toward the creek bed. The unconscious guard remained undiscovered, and most of the camp's attention was still focused on the fires to the south. They had nearly reached the safety of the creek when a shout rang out behind them. "Halt! Stop where you are!" Mason turned to see a soldier emerging from the shadows of the main building, rifle raised. Without hesitation, he pushed Tehia toward the creek. "Run," he ordered. "Follow the water north. Don't stop." "Not without you," she insisted. "I'll be right behind you," he promised, drawing his revolver. "Go, Tehia, now!" She hesitated just a moment longer, then obeyed, moving with surprising speed and confidence despite her blindness. The soldier fired, the shot going wide in the darkness. Mason returned fire, aiming low to wound rather than kill. The soldier fell with a cry, clutching his leg. More shouts erupted across the camp as the alarm spread. The soldiers who had pursued the diversionary fires would soon return. Mason needed to buy time for Tehia to get safely away. An idea struck him. Walsh's quarters would be in the main building, and with the camp in chaos, this might be his only chance to find evidence of the captain's conspiracy with Harlow. Making a split-second decision, Mason darted toward the main building, slipping inside through a side door. The interior was dimly lit by a single lamp, revealing a common area with a desk and several doors leading to private quarters. One door stood slightly ajar, revealing a more elaborate setup than the others. Walsh's office, no doubt. Mason entered cautiously, aware that every second increased the danger. The room was neat, military in its precision. A writing desk stood against one wall, papers arranged in tidy stacks. Working quickly, Mason rifled through the documents, looking for anything connecting Walsh to Harlow or the false raids. Most were ordinary military correspondence, reports on troop movements and supply requisitions. Then, in a drawer, he found what he was seeking, a letter from Victor Harlow on Chicago letterhead, detailing arrangements for creating circumstances that would necessitate the military intervention, and promising Walsh a substantial payment upon successful relocation of the Apache obstacle. Mason folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. It was the proof he needed, explicit evidence of conspiracy to fabricate attacks and displace the Apache for financial gain. As he turned to leave, a voice froze him in place. "Looking for something, Reeves?" Captain Harrison Walsh stood in the doorway, revolver leveled at Mason's chest. His uniform was dusty from the ride to the southern ridge, his expression a mixture of anger and something like satisfaction. "Should have known you'd try something foolish," Walsh continued, stepping into the room. "Always were a man led by sentiment rather than sense." Mason kept his hand near his own weapon, calculating his chances. It's over, Walsh. I know about Harlow, about the staged raids. A thin smile crossed the captain's face. Know all you want. Who's going to believe a recluse rancher over a decorated army officer? Especially when that rancher is shot trying to free an enemy prisoner. I have proof, Mason replied. In writing. Something flickered in Walsh's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, before his expression hardened once more. Hand it over. Slowly. Instead of complying, Mason lunged sideways, drawing his revolver as Walsh fired. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, but Mason managed to return fire, his bullet striking Walsh in the upper chest. The captain staggered backward, surprise registering on his face before he collapsed against the doorframe, his revolver clattering to the floor. Blood spread rapidly across his uniform jacket. Mason approached cautiously, his own wound sending waves of pain down his arm. Walsh looked up at him, eyes already growing distant. You don't understand, the captain gasped. The Apache, in the way of progress, had to be removed. Progress built on lies isn't progress, Mason replied, retrieving Walsh's fallen weapon. It's just another form of theft. Walsh's lips twisted in a grimace that might have been a smile. We're not so different, Reeves. Both willing to kill for what we want. The comparison stung, but Mason pushed it aside. The difference is I'm fighting for someone else's freedom. You're fighting for your own gain. Walsh didn't respond, his eyes fixed on something beyond the room, beyond Mason. A final breath rattled from his lungs, and then he was gone. Mason checked the captain's pulse to confirm what he already knew, then quickly searched the body, finding a small notebook in an inner pocket. It contained dates, locations, and details of the staged raids, further evidence of the conspiracy. Outside, shouting and the sound of returning horses indicated the soldiers were regrouping. Mason had little time to escape. Clutching his wounded shoulder, he slipped out through a back window, staying in the shadows as he made his way toward the creek. Blood soaked his shirt, and his vision occasionally blurred, but determination drove him forward. Tahia was waiting. He had promised to follow her. The creek bed provided cover as he moved north, away from the camp. Behind him, the commotion continued to grow as Walsh's body was discovered and search parties organized. After nearly a mile, Mason's strength began to falter. The blood loss was taking its toll, making each step more difficult than the last. He stumbled, catching himself against a boulder, breathing heavily in the cold night air. Mason? Tahia's voice came from nearby, followed by her figure emerging from behind a cluster of willows. She had waited for him, despite his instructions to continue north. You're hurt, she said immediately, her acute hearing picking up his labored breathing. Shot. Left shoulder. Mason leaned against her as she guided him into the shelter of the willows. Walsh is dead. I found proof of the conspiracy. That can wait, she said firmly. First, we must stop the bleeding. She helped him remove his coat and shirt, her fingers gentle but efficient as they explored the wound. Clean through. No bullet to remove. That's good. From a pocket in her dress, she produced a small pouch. Medicines I took from Walsh's camp. They will help. Mason watched in amazement as she worked, applying powdered herbs to both the entry and exit wounds, then binding them tightly with strips torn from her own petticoat. Her blindness seemed no hindrance as her fingers moved with practiced precision. How do you do that, he asked. Work so accurately without seeing? A small smile touched her lips. I see with my hands, with my ears, with my heart. She finished the bandage, her fingers lingering briefly on his bare shoulder. Some things don't require eyes to understand. The tenderness in her touch sent warmth through Mason that had nothing to do with his injury. He caught her hand in his, holding it gently. Thank you, he said softly, for waiting, for everything. I told you our paths were meant to cross, Mason Reeves. Her expression grew serious. But we must move quickly. The soldiers will search the creek first. Mason nodded, pulling his bloodied shirt and coat back on with Tahia's help. Taylor's men left horses for us about 2 miles north. If we can reach them, we can make it to the trapper's cabin by dawn. They moved carefully through the darkness, Tahia's hand on Mason's arm, both to guide herself and to support him. Despite the pain and danger, Mason felt a strange sense of rightness, as though all the broken pieces of his life were finally finding their proper alignment. Dawn found them deep in the northern foothills, at a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees. The structure was weathered but solid, built by a trapper who had long since moved on, leaving the place to the elements and occasional travelers. Mason lit a fire in the stone hearth while Taya examined his wound again, changing the bandage with fresh herbs from the forest around them. "You've lost blood, but the wound is clean," she said, her fingers gentle on his skin. "With rest, you will heal." "We may not have time for rest," Mason reminded her. "Walsh's men will be searching, and we need to get word to your father about what's happened." Tahia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There is a place, 3 days' ride from here, where messages can be left for my people. If we can reach it, we will," Mason assured her. "But first, we need to secure this evidence against Harlow. If he learns Walsh is dead, he'll try to cover his tracks." He showed her the letter and notebook he had taken from Walsh, explaining their significance. Tahia listened carefully, her face grave. "Many will still not want to believe," she warned. "It is easier to blame the Apache than to admit their own kind could be so dishonorable." "Some will listen," Mason countered. "Sheriff Logan, for one, and Taylor's men will back up our story." They discussed their next steps as the day wore on, deciding to rest until nightfall before continuing north toward the message site Tahia knew. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin's single window, Mason found himself studying Tahia's face in the fading light. She sat by the fire, her hands working methodically to create more medicine from plants she had gathered outside. Her movements were sure, her expression serene despite the dangers they faced. Her long black hair, freed from its braid, fell like a curtain around her shoulders. "I can feel you watching me," she said without turning her head. Mason smiled slightly. "Still not used to how you do that." "Do what?" "See without seeing. Know things you shouldn't be able to know." She set aside her work, turning toward his voice. "All people see more than they realize, Mason. They simply don't pay attention to what their senses tell them." "Is that how you knew about Rebecca? About our daughter?" The question had lingered since that stormy night when Tahia had first revealed her knowledge of his deepest pain. "Partly," she admitted. "But there was more. Sometimes spirits speak to those willing to listen." She hesitated. "Your daughter's spirit has been with you through all these years, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you to heal, to live again." Tahia's voice was gentle. "She cannot rest while you remain trapped in grief." Mason considered this, surprised to find that the idea brought comfort rather than pain. "What was her name?" he asked suddenly. "In your vision, did she have a name?" A soft smile touched Tahia's lips. "Hope." The name resonated within him, feeling right in a way he couldn't explain. "Hope," he repeated softly. Yes, that would have been her name. Silence fell between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. "What happens after this, Taya?" Mason asked finally. "If we succeed in clearing your people's name and stopping Harlow's plan, what then?" The question hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. "That depends," she replied carefully. "On many things, on what you want." "What I want?" Mason moved from his place by the window to sit beside her near the fire. 5 weeks ago, I wouldn't have known how to answer that. I existed, nothing more. And now, he took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. Now I know exactly what I want. To live, not just survive. To build something meaningful again. He paused. To be with you if that's what you want too. Taya's expression softened, vulnerability replacing her usual composure. There would be difficulties. Your people and mine. "I don't care about that," Mason said firmly. "I've spent too many years alone, Tahia. Too many years hiding from life. I won't do it anymore." She reached up, her fingers finding his face, tracing the contours of his features as if memorizing them. "I have seen your heart, Mason Reeves. Its pain, its strength, its capacity for love." Her touch lingered on his lips. "Yes, I want to be with you too." Mason leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a gentle kiss that deepened as her arms went around him. The pain in his wounded shoulder faded to insignificance compared to the warmth spreading through his chest. When they finally parted, Tahia rested her forehead against his. Whatever comes, she whispered, we face it together. Together, he agreed. Outside, night had fallen completely, stars emerging in the vast Wyoming sky. Inside the small cabin, two souls once isolated by circumstance and loss found in each other the healing they had both sought for so long. The next 3 days passed in a blur of cautious travel, moving only at night, hiding during daylight hours. Mason's shoulder improved under Tahia's care, though it remained stiff and painful. They encountered no pursuit, suggesting that either the army was searching in the wrong direction or had other priorities after Walsh's death. On the fourth day, they reached the message site Tahia had described, a rock formation shaped like a bear with a hollow beneath that served as a natural mailbox. She left a message wrapped in leather, marked with symbols Mason couldn't read. How long until your father receives it, he asked as they made camp that night in a sheltered canyon. Days, perhaps a week, she replied. It depends on when the messengers check this place. Mason nodded, adding wood to their small fire. The nights were growing colder as winter deepened its grip on the territory. We should head for Pine Ridge tomorrow, he decided. Take the evidence to Sheriff Logan. With Walsh dead, Harlow may be vulnerable. Tahia looked troubled. The town will not welcome me, Mason. Things have changed, he reminded her. We have proof now. And not everyone was against you, Margaret Wilson for one. She nodded reluctantly. Very well, but we should be cautious. The journey to Pine Ridge took 2 more days, their progress slowed by the need to avoid main trails and potential army patrols. They arrived at the outskirts of town just after dusk, the lights of buildings glowing warmly in the gathering darkness. Mason left Tahia hidden in a stand of trees while he scouted ahead, moving carefully through the back streets toward the sheriff's office. The town seemed unusually quiet, with few people about despite the early hour. He found Sheriff Logan alone in his office, hat off, a glass of whiskey on his desk. The older man looked up as Mason entered, surprise quickly replaced by something like resignation. Figured you'd show up eventually, Reeves, Logan said, pushing the whiskey aside. Half the territory's looking for you. I have proof, Sheriff, Mason replied without preamble, placing Walsh's notebook and Harlow's letter on the desk. The raids were staged. Walsh and Harlow were working together to drive the Apache off their land. Logan studied the documents carefully, his expression growing grim as he read. This is damning, he admitted finally, especially combined with what else we've learned. What do you mean? The sheriff leaned back in his chair. After Walsh was killed, his men found Harlow at Taylor's Creek, right where your Apache woman said he'd be. But instead of arresting him, Lieutenant Parker, Walsh's second, joined in forces with him. They're planning to attack Running Bear's band tomorrow at dawn. Mason felt cold dread settle in his stomach. On what grounds? Claimed they found evidence the Apache were massing for an attack. Said it was self-defense. Logan's expression was disgusted. But one of the young soldiers came to me yesterday. Said the evidence was planted on Walsh's orders before he died. Where are they now, Parker and Harlow? Camped about 5 miles west of the reservation boundary. Got about 30 men between them, soldiers and Harlow's hired guns. Logan met Mason's gaze directly. They plan to wipe out the entire band, Reeves, men, women, children. Make it look like they resisted. The brutality of the plan matched what Mason knew of Walsh, but hearing it stated so bluntly still shocked him. We have to stop them. How? They've got numbers and the authority of the U.S. Army behind them, false though it may be. Logan gestured at the evidence on his desk. This might be enough for the territorial governor, but he's 2 weeks' ride away. By then, it'll be too late. Mason thought quickly, possibilities racing through his mind. What about Taylor's men and others in town who've had doubts? Maybe a dozen men total, Logan estimated, against 30 in the element of surprise. We don't need to defeat them, Mason pointed out. Just delay them long enough for Running Bear to move his people to safety. The sheriff considered this. Might work if your woman's message reached them in time. And if not, we warn them ourselves, Mason decided. Tonight. Logan looked surprised. We? I'm assuming you're not going to sit by while innocent people are slaughtered, Sheriff. A slow smile spread across the older man's face. No, Reeves, I reckon I'm not. He stood, retrieving his hat and coat. Let me round up who I can. Meet me at the livery in an hour. Mason nodded, returning the sheriff's resolute expression. 1 hour. As Logan left to gather allies, Mason tucked the evidence back inside his coat. The path ahead was dangerous, possibly fatal, but for the first time in years, he felt fully alive, purpose burning through his veins like fire. He would protect Tahia's people. He would expose Harlow's crime. And whatever came after, he would face it with the woman who had brought light back into his darkness. Together, as they had promised. Now and always. Epilogue. Spring came early to the northern Wyoming hills, melting snow and bringing fresh green to the valleys. At the Reeves Ranch, new life flourished everywhere. Young calves in the pasture, a garden taking shape behind the cabin, wildflowers dotting the hillsides. Mason stood on the porch watching as Tahia worked among the newly planted herbs. Her movements were sure, her fingers knowing exactly where each seedling should go despite her blindness. She wore a dress of soft buckskin, adorned with beads that caught the morning sunlight. The past months had transformed both the ranch and its inhabitants. The building stood straight again, fences mended, fields cleared for planting. Inside the cabin, new furniture brightened the once sparse room, a larger bed, comfortable chairs, colorful weavings on the walls. But the greatest transformation was in Mason himself. The grief that had defined him for so long had not vanished but had changed shape, becoming a gentle memory rather than a crushing weight. He smiled more often now, laughed sometimes, and looked forward rather than back. The battle at the reservation boundary seemed like a lifetime ago. They had arrived just in time to warn Running Bear of the impending attack, allowing the Apache to withdraw to a defensible position in the hills. When Parker and Harlow attacked at dawn, they found not sleeping families but prepared warriors, and Sheriff Logan's men at their rear. The fighting had been brief but fierce. Harlow died in the first volley, shot by one of Taylor's men. Parker surrendered when he saw his position was hopeless, his soldiers reluctantly laying down their weapons. In the aftermath, the territorial governor had arrived to investigate, bringing with him officials from Washington. The evidence Mason had gathered proved decisive. Harlow's letter, Walsh's notebook, testimony from soldiers who had participated in the staged raids. The conspiracy was exposed. The Apache exonerated. Running Bear had negotiated a new treaty, one that protected the core of Apache lands while allowing for limited settlement in boundary areas. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair and enforced by honest men, including Sheriff Logan, who had been appointed as a liaison between settlers and the tribe. As for Mason and Tahia, their path had been clear. She had chosen to stay with him, building a new life that bridged both their worlds. They were married twice, once by a judge in Pine Ridge, once in an Apache ceremony presided over by Running Bear himself. Not everyone approved, of course. There were still those in town who looked askance at their union, who whispered behind their backs. But they were outnumbered now by those who had seen the truth, who understood that strength came from unity rather than division. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Tahia observed, rising from her gardening to join him on the porch. Mason smiled, drawing her close, just appreciating how much has changed. "For the better?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "For the better," he confirmed, kissing her gently. "Though I still can't believe how it all began, with a signature I never meant to give." Tahia laughed softly, the sound still new enough to delight him. The best journeys often begin when we least expect them. Together they stood watching the spring sun rise higher over their land, casting long shadows that gradually shortened as morning deepened. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Inside the cabin, on a shelf near the fire, stood a small wooden carving, a mother and child, carved by Mason's own hand. Beside it lay a worn piece of paper, the signature still visible after all these months. A mistake that had become a blessing. A moment of chance that had led to lasting love. A darkness transformed by unexpected light. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where Samuel Reed approached with the mail. Mason raised a hand in greeting, Tahia smiling beside him. Life continued, their story unfolded, and in the silence between words, in the spaces between heartbeats, they found all the answers they had ever sought.